Good afternoon. It's 4:15 here in Cincinnati. Welcome to week 4 of Business 101, Introduction to Business. And this afternoon and early this evening, we're going to cover chapters 10, 11, and 12. Chapter 10, as you can see on the screen, Motivating Employees. We'll then move to chapter 10, we'll talk about some interesting motivation theories. Chapter 11 focuses on human resource management, finding and keeping the best employees. And finally, we'll move to chapter 12, which deals with unions and employee and management issues. So let's look at our learning objectives for chapter 10. Explain Fred Taylor's theory of scientific management. Describe the Hawthorne studies and their significance to management. We'll look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and look at those and try to apply them to employee motivation. Distinguish between motivators and hygiene factors identified by Hertzberg. Differentiate among theory X, theory Y, and theory Z. Mostly we're going to talk about theory X and theory Y, a little bit about theory Z. We'll look at the key principles of goal setting, expectancy, reinforcement, and equity theories of motivation. We'll look at how managers put the motivation theories into action. That's the strategies using job enrichment, open communication, and job recognition. And then finally, we'll show how managers personalize motivation strategies to appeal to employees across the globe and across generations. All right, so let's move into chapter 10. And we find out as we start here that we people being managers or leaders have two ways to reward employees. And one is not something that really comes from a manager or a leader, him or herself. It's what you see on the screen, an intrinsic reward. This is a reward that an individual employee gets from realizing that he or she has completed a task well and it's to the best of his or her ability. Notice what it says here in the bottom. It's the sense of achievement. I know I've done this. I can see that this is done well and it's going to turn out well. On the other hand, we have what are known as extrinsic rewards. And these are rewards given to employees by others. Things like pay raises, promotions, certificates of merit, if you will, and things of that nature. So that not only does the employee receive that from you, Mr. Manager or Miss Leader, he or she is also being recognized in front of his or her peers. Now, the first thing we're going to go to here is we're going to talk about Fred Taylor, who is known as the father of scientific management. Fred Taylor is the first one to put a science, as if you will, to developing tasks. And notice that what Taylor was after was he was after getting people to do work most efficiently and to keep them from doing things that were extraneous from their particular job that would keep them away from completing the tasks that went into completing the job. So he focused on 3 elements, pardon me, which you can see here on the slide. And I think one of his most important one, besides the others of time and methods, was rules. And that's what he wanted to set up. So Taylor came to what we have here are his 4 key principles. And we can see these, and you can look at them. And I want to home in on this codifying the best methods. And I'm going to relate the best story that I can with Taylor. But also he talked about a fair level of not only performance, but pay. So paying people for the performance you did. Taylor did his work and then published it later on with Bethlehem Steel in 1911. And his classic example was working with a gentleman by the name of Schmidt, who was a pig hauler. Now, people who haul pigs were hauling slabs of iron ore that weighed 100 pounds, called a pig, down to be smelted down and to moved and become steel. And Taylor said to him, as he would say across the board to other people who adopted his methods, I want you to have the right tools to work with. I want you to work when I tell you to work, and I want you to stop working when I tell you to stop working. In other words, take a rest. Now, before Taylor worked with Schmidt and showed Schmidt how to haul this by giving him the proper tools to use, Schmidt was hauling 12.5 tons of pig a day. After Taylor worked with him and showed him how to improve his performance, Schmidt started hauling 47.5 tons of pig a day, almost a fourfold advancement over what he was doing. Now, what we need to understand here is that his productivity increased and returned 258% to the company. His pay only improved by 61% from $1.12 to $1.83 a day. And I said a day, not an hour. That's how people were paid back in 1911. So while Taylor did talk about having good pay, he didn't think that workers should get too much pay, because if they did, they wouldn't pay attention to management, and they did want more pay and more benefits and things of that nature. Taylor's work led to what's known here, see here on the slide, are time and motion studies, popularized by two people, a married couple, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who had a book written about them, or wrote a book called Cheaper by the Dozen. That's because they had 12 children. And they were so successful with their methods that when Frank died early, Lillian kept the business on, which is very unheard of for women in those days. I'm not saying there weren't women doing that, but it was unheard of for women to do that. Kept this going. Now, one of the things that we need to stop and understand here for a minute is that some of Taylor's principles, if not all of his principles, are still in use today. The most successful company that uses Taylor's principles is UPS. And there's a big story about UPS in your text on page 271. And I think you should take a little bit of time to read. It doesn't take too long. And they have certain rules. They want their drivers to get out of the vehicle and land on the certain foot, the right foot. They want them to carry their keys in a certain method. They want them to take a step that's so long. And one of the reasons that they do this is that they want to minimize the decision-making process that their drivers and other people that have similar type jobs for them, like them, need to make on a routine basis. And by doing that, they believe that that they can be more efficient. And UPS has done very well. And as a matter of fact, they have a very good track record of keeping employees for a long period of time. Not because their pay is all that good. Their pay is not bad, but it's not the top of the list. But they do things for people. They give them benefits, and they do other things for them. They cross-train them, and so they do have a very, very good track record of keeping people over a long haul. So there's Fred Taylor and UPS. We went from in the study of management, we went from Fred Taylor's scientific management to the Hawthorne studies. Now, the Hawthorne studies were conducted I have to stop and think from in Hawthorne, Illinois. That's why they're called the Hawthorne studies. They were studied at a Western Electric plant, which was in those days the research arm of American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. And what they were trying to do here was look at, as the slide says, now there were other things, but this one particular study they did was to see how well people performed at work in various levels of light. And they eventually reduced the light to what you would see as moonlight. Now, I want you to stop and think about this. Was moonlight that you would see if you walked outside your house in the late 1920s or early 1930s. We didn't have all the skyscrapers and all the buildings that we had in the United States that we have today. We have many fewer people in those days. So the light from a moon might have been a little brighter than what we see today in a city. If you go out in the desert, the moon's very bright in some other unpopulated areas. What the researchers found out was that regardless of the light conditions, how much light there was or how much light there wasn't, productivity increased. And what they found out was that this was a twofold thing. Number one, it was the group working together. And second, people work differently when they know they're being observed, or as the slide says down at the bottom, being studied. So it's the same difference. Now, there were other things that came in here, other parts of the study that are not mentioned here in the text. And that was there was the bank wiring room, and there was another couple of other ones that they had. One was they decided to reduce the work week from 6 days, which was normal in the late 1920s and early 1930s, to 5 days. And what they expected, the researchers expected, was that production would decrease by 16%. Divide 6 into 100, the answer is 16 2/3. So round out off, say 16%. That's rounding off lower, by the way, 16%. So that would reduce by 16%. And what they found again was that the productivity increased. So what again we have here is people knowing they're being studied and that they work differently. It also brought in the social dynamic of work. And so we're thinking about things other than just the work itself. One of the most famous theories, motivational theories that we know, and probably is popularized by more, greatly popularized over others, I suppose the best way to put it, is Maslow's theory of hierarchy. And what Maslow simply said is that there are 5 levels in his pyramid, and they start from the most basic, which is physiological. And remember, a pyramid, you have broad base, and then it goes up to an apex. And then you have physiological, and then you have safety, and then you have social needs and esteem needs and self-actualization. What Maslow said was, and let's go to the pyramid itself, and then you can see the pyramid displayed at figure 10.1 in your text on page 274. And what Maslow really said was that all these needs exist, but that you could not move from a lower level need to a higher level need, for instance, physiological to safety, until the physiological was satisfied. Physiological being things like food and water, keeping body and soul together. Safety would be housing and things of that nature. Social needs, exactly what it says. And then he said that the 2 higher order needs were esteem and self-actualization. So the one criticism of Maslow is that researchers have not been able to replicate the fact that you have to have one need satisfied before you can move to the other need, or that you couldn't be trying to satisfy 2 needs at the same time. Another researcher who came along who has a great deal of impact, and his theories in the workplaces, Hertzberg's motivating factors. Now, Hertzberg centered on two things, trying to increase worker motivation, and want to know what factors that managers control could do this, and how do they work job-related factors, that is, the workers. So Hertzberg had a great deal, and you could look at his list, his laundry list, if you will, from the workers, which begins at the bottom of page 274 and continues at the top of page 275. Notice that pay, well, it's important to all of us, is number 8. It's not listed number 1. And so Hertzberger found that there were two kinds of factors. A motivator, something that would cause people to want to do their job and to do well. Notice he says at the bottom here, it gives them a sense of satisfaction and achievement. And what he called as hygiene factors, those that had to do with the job context, not the job content, not what was in the job context, what you found, or the environment of the job, if you prefer. And those things are like pay, working conditions, managerial, how well they work with you, working with others, etc. And he said, here are the hygiene factors. Notice he says here, factors that can cause dissatisfaction on the job. So in other words, if you worked in a noisy environment or dusty environment or something of that nature, and you're always fighting that, you would have problems. But removing those or improving them, if you will, in other words, taking away the problem areas, will not necessarily motivate people to do a better job. It's just something that comes with the job. And so Hertzberg has this motivators and hygiene factors, and we can see this at figure 10.2 at the bottom of page 275. And notice what he talks about here. What are motivating factors? The work itself, achievement, recognition, satisfaction, etc. Whereas the hygiene factors are things like supervision, the working conditions, like I mentioned before, environment, etc. And then notice the last one, salary, status, and job security. And so we would think that there would be something different, but it's not. This is what he came up with. Now, here in this particular slide, we want to show how Maslow on the left compares to Hertzberg on the right. Again, you can see this in your text, figure 10.3 at the top of page 276. I apologize. So notice self-actualization for Maslow compares with work itself, achievement, possibility of growth, etc. And I'm not going to read all these to you, but I want to make sure that you see them. Now, there is one thing, or there are two things that we need to talk here about Hertzberg. First of all, Hertzberg's theory has proved very important to many managers, but Hertzberg's theory has not been replicated by other researchers. Now, one of the reasons that it is because Hertzberg he did his work with, and his associates did their work with 200 individuals who were either accountants or engineers. That is not a random sample of the work population in the United States or any other country. And of course, as we know anything about accountants or engineers, they tend to be very precise people. Now, it doesn't mean to say that's not a negative. That's a statement of fact. You know, they're working with facts and figures all the time, so they need to be precise. Nevertheless, what Hertzberg came up with, as I mentioned, has proved very beneficial for managers, and they use Hertzberg, even though the researchers have not been able to replicate his findings. Now, we come next to McGregor's theory of X and Y. And if you want to put this like you learned in, I guess it was algebra or geometry on an x and y axis, they have the x-axis and the y-axis. And you notice that on the x and the y-axis, they don't ever get along unless they cross. Well, it's a little bit different here. Theory X says people don't like work. They don't want to come to work. They have to be forced to work. You have to have a punishment. You have to have a kick and you have to have a stick and a carrot. The stick being punishment, the carrot being salary. And they don't want to be responsible for anything. And the only reason they do any work is because they're afraid they're going to get punished. And part of that punishment may be their pay would be docked. Well, McGregor says there's another type of theory here, another part of this theory, and that's just the direct opposite. And the people do like to work. It's as normal as play. It's as normal as recreation. It's as normal as you sleep 6 to 8 hours a day. They like responsibility. They don't shirk responsibility. They like to use their brains. They like to be in the decision-making process. And it's just not fear or pay that motivates people. They're motivated. We go back to intrinsic rewards, knowing I've done this job very well. I have a sense of satisfaction. I have a sense of achievement. So what he says is that really, if we want to attract people and to keep people, we have to think more about being like theory Y, to use individuals to their greatest capacity. Now, does this mean that some people don't need to be directed? It does not. Does it mean that direction is always bad? It does not. What it says is let's meet people where they are and get the best out of them. Now, William Uchi has come up with a little bit different theory that I don't really dwell on too much, but it does give you some kind of idea. He talked about the cultural differences between workers in the United States and workers in Japan. He called Americans type A, Japanese type J. And he said that the Japanese people are committed to the organization and are committed to group goals. Whereas we in the United States and many other Western countries, especially those that are of English origin, would be Britain itself, and then of course Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, focus on us, the individual. We're not collective people. And so what he proposes, Uchi proposes a hybrid. And the hybrid is here. He shows the American on the left, type A. He shows the Japanese, type J, on the right. And then the modified, notice he uses the term modified American as type Z. One of the things that I differ with Uchi, by the way, I certainly don't hold Uchi's credentials. One of the things that I differ with Uchi is he talks here about this long-term employment. We find, especially in the tech industry, that individuals don't seek long-term employment today, that they're probably going to go from job to job. Yeah, they're going to work for a company for a while, but they don't necessarily think of long-term employment. Long-term employment means different things to different people, but we would say something in excess of 10 years. I'm not denigrating what he's come up with here. Please don't misunderstand me. It is useful. It's also useful for us to keep in our minds that there are very basic differences between the Japanese worker and the American worker. Japan has a culture that embeds and inbreeds this type of philosophy that they have. Well, how do they do that? 97%, or probably even a little bit more, of the people who live in Japan are ethnic Japanese. There's not 97% anything in the United States. We're a polyglot society made up of Caucasians. Well, I don't like to use that word because that really doesn't describe white people. Caucasian only means people come from area of the Caucasus Mountains in Eastern Europe and Russia. White people, and which right now are the predominant in our society, but black people and red people and brown people and yellow people, etc. I'm talking here about skin color, not anything other than that. And so we have different perspectives. We come from different cultures, etc., etc. The only thing that I think that holds us together is we always look for the silver bullet to come up with solutions, and we're short-term people. We want to fix something today, and we want to get on to the next problem. We don't think down the road like the Japanese do long term. We've changed our philosophy, especially in manufacturing and production, to think in those directions. But we're still an individualistic people, and we will probably continue to be that way for a number of years. This next slide gives us a comparison of theory X, theory Y, and theory Z. You can see this at the bottom of page 279 in figure 10.5. And I'm really not going to go into that too much because we've talked about that. It is useful to look at theory Z and see, if you wish, how theory Z tries to meld the two together. It doesn't really, I don't think. It sort of takes off on theory Y and tries to improve that. Another motivation theory is called goal setting. And we can see this here on the slide. And this is where the individual, and here we're talking in the workplace, the employee and his or her supervisor sit down at the beginning of a period of time. Usually we talk about this as a rating time, performance appraisal rating time. And they develop goals for the coming period of time. Usually a year, but sometimes you'll find those in sequence of 3 months. And then once they come to agreement on this and they accept those, they'll write this into what we would call a contract. And then the way this works, they have periodic reviews where they sit down and look at what's been accomplished, what needs to be changed. Maybe they're going to change some of the goals, et cetera, et cetera. One of the key things here is that the goals agreed upon have to be attainable. Now, I like to use the term the goals should be moderately difficult. Some people will like to drop the modifier moderately and just say difficult. But they also need to be, I want to repeat, they need to be achievable. Because if an employee sees that no matter what he or she does, given all the resources that possibly need, that they can't complete the goal, they won't try. So it has to be something they can see can be achievable. You don't want it to be too easy, because if it's too easy, they say, hey, well, anybody can do this. I'm going to do something different. Or they're going to get bored. So they have to be something that has a degree of difficulty built in, and it has to be achievable. And of course, as I said before, and maybe got a little bit lost there in translation, the employee has to have the needed resources. He or she doesn't have the resources, they're not going to be able to perform the job. One of the most often used goal setting theories, if you will, is what's known as management by objectives, MBO. And this is kind of the same way, where they have different objectives and they're agreed upon, and everybody sits down and they write the goals out and the objectives and how they're going to get there. Obviously, we have to monitor what's going on. There's some complaint about this, and the complaint is because there is an emphasis on the goals and the objectives to be achieved. They sometimes take on greater importance than the organization's mission, goals, and objectives. There's a lot of paperwork required, and there's a lot of review process required. Doesn't mean to say it can't be done. It just, if you get into this, you have to understand that there are some constraints, and they have to be worked through. Now this is organization. What's MBO, management by objectives, And you don't see this slide in your text, but notice here we set the objectives. Now, the objectives should stem from the organization's objectives. And then you could link them to the goals, and somebody has to monitor, evaluate performance, reward performance, and it's a cycle or a circle, if you want, that continues. These are just some of the companies that use MBO. You might be interested to find that Toyota uses MBO when we think of the Japanese doing incremental improvement. The next theory we talk about is expectancy theory. And you can see expectancy theory, we're going to get to it in a slide here in a second. But notice what the employee goes through. He or she asks, can I do this? What's my reward? And is my reward worth what I'm doing or the effort I'm going to expend? And we'll look at it here graphically, and you can see it in your text, the figure 10.6 at the top of page 281. Notice here, first question again, we go back to, can I accomplish the task? And if the answer is no, the person is not motivated and everything stops. If the employee says yes, then he or she moves to the next step in his or her mind and looks at the outcome. And the outcome is the reward. And the reward is it worth the effort I'm going to put into this? Again, no, not motivated. If yes, he or she becomes motivated, and then goes on and completes the task. Nadler and Lawler modified this to some extent, and I think, to me, the most important thing is at the beginning is to determine the rewards that the employee values. And those should be the type of rewards that are put into this and used for expectancy theory. And then the fourth one down here, tie the reward to the performance. Now, what that says, if you stop and think about it, pardon me, is if the performance is satisfactory but not top-notch, then the reward won't be top-notch. It'll be somewhere down the scale. And the last part is making sure that the employee believes that the rewards are adequate for the work he's done. So this all comes in together, okay? And the other thing is we'll have to look at standards to make sure that they're part of this thing. A reinforcement theory has been around for a long period of time. You may know this as part of Pavlov and his dog. That's kind of a reinforcement theory. We have positive and negative reinforcements. And positive reinforcement simply says, when you do that to an employee, hey, I liked what you did and I want you to continue doing what you're doing. Now, notice what all this is. I only used praise. I didn't use pay and I didn't use recognition. Now, if you of course, at times, praise will be part of recognition or vice versa, especially if you're doing this in an open forum. And individual will understand this and we'll move forward. Negative reinforcement actually says to the employee, I don't want you doing that again. And it comes in various ways. You can punish them and however you do that. And the last part is extinction. And here what you're trying to do is stop the behavior by not responding to it. So you don't even acknowledge it's going on. It's ignoring, if you will. The next theory we come to is a very, at least to me, is a very important theory, and one that we see all the time and we don't always stop and think about it. And that's equity theory. Equity theory is shown here on your in the text on page 282. We don't have a figure to look at it. But what the employee is trying to do here is to maintain equity, equilibrium, if you prefer, between what he is or she is doing, the inputs and the outputs, compared to someone else doing the same job. Now, I use someone else and didn't use exactly what the slide says, because what happens here is Mr. or Miss Employee chooses a comparable other. I want to be compared to, I'm comparing my work to Sally Jones, or I'm comparing my work to Bob Smith, and that's my comparison other. So if we have a perceived equity, everything's good. If we have a perceived inequity, then the employee is going to do one of several things, none of which has a good outcome. He or she is going to stop doing what they're doing because it's inequitable. He's on the short end of the stick, or she's on the short end of the stick. They're going to look for a new comparison other, and most likely, at least in my estimation, that comparison other will not be at the same standard as the other comparison other. It will be lower, which means that that production level will decrease, or he or she is going to look to go elsewhere. So none of those have a very good outcome for the organization. Now, one of the things we want to do is we want to try to enrich people's jobs, and we can do that several ways. And we're going to talk about those. When we think about enriching jobs along the lines of Hertzberg's motivational strategy. And remember that Hertzberg's talking about enriching a person's job. Oh, he didn't use that particular term or those terms. By the job itself, the achievement, satisfaction, etc. So these are key characteristics that we talk about here, motivating through job enrichment. And there are 5 factors here. You can see these displayed in your text on page 283. A skill variety, task identity, significance of the task, autonomy, being left alone to do the job, and then receiving feedback from your supervisor or manager on how well you're performing. There are several different types of job enrichment. Again, you can see these in the text, same page, page 283, down toward the bottom of the page. First is job enlargement. The second is job rotation. A job enlargement is a type of job enrichment which combines a series of tasks that used to be performed independently, think of being performed by others, into one interesting assignment. So it's bringing other tasks in. Obviously, the tasks have always been related, but they've been performed separately. Job rotation is exactly what it says. That's moving people around from job to job within an organization, so they get so they become more valuable to the organization, and so that they learn more, and they're able to do more. We can get job enrichment by flexibility. Now, here's another way to get this, and you'll get this in your video with a container score about using communication to motivate. I want you to notice the second bullet, training managers and supervisors to listen. Listening is very important. If it weren't as important as it is, we wouldn't have 2 ears. We would have 1 ear like we have 1 mouth. So it's very important that we listen, and we listen for content. What is it the individual is saying? And we have to learn, although the text doesn't really talk a great deal about this, we have to be able to repeat what the individual says, known as paraphrasing, so we understand what he or she is saying. So if we say back to them, I understand you to say. So that shows two things. Number one, that we were paying attention, we were listening, and we're interested in what they had to say, and we're trying to help them come to some kind of resolution. Look at the last thing. Asking an employee what's important to him or her. Isn't that a novel idea? It's something we really need to think about. This simply talks about using social media to communicate with employees. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. We have to recognize good work, and we can recognize that in a number of different ways. I mentioned it here. Positive employee remedies to improve morale. Look at the first one, open communication, 48%. The rest of them are all much less, but they're still important. But listening, open communication. What's bad? Lack of open communication leads the list. And again, most of the rest are of lesser importance, not that they're not, but they're lesser importance. Failure to recognize achievements, micromanaging, which some of you brought up in a couple of your forum posts about things that we've read, etc. We have to recognize that there are cultural differences, and there are cultural differences between people that we work with and people that we interact with at work. High context culture, relationships, group trust, etc. Those are people outside, many people outside the United States, Asian cultures, etc. Low context is us, believing relationships detract from building the tasks. So we need to know other cultures. We need to know what's important to them. We need to try to learn their languages if we're dealing with them, and their customs, etc. This just talks about motivating some of the different ones. Baby boomers, are not many left. Most of them are leaving the workforce or they're downsizing. Generation X, Generation Y, we have to talk about what they do and how to connect with those people. And then Generation Z. Millennials, etc. That brings us to the end of chapter 10. We are going to take a break now. It is 5:58. We'll take a break until 5 o'clock, and then we'll return and get into chapter 11, which, as I mentioned, is motivating employees. So please return in 2 minutes for chapter 11 at motivating employees. Excuse me, it's human resource management and finding and keeping the best employees. Please come back at 5 o'clock. Thank you. All right, 5 o'clock, we're back. Finding and keeping the best employees, human resource management. Let's look at our objectives for Chapter 11. Explain the importance of human resource management and describe current issues in managing human resources. Illustrate the effects of legislation on human resource management. We'll talk about some of them. Summarize the 5 steps in human resource planning. Describe methods that companies use to recruit new employees and explain some of the issues that make recruiting challenging. It's always a challenge. Outline the 6 steps in selecting employees. Pardon me. Illustrate employee training and development methods. We'll look at the 6 steps in appraising employee performance. And then finally, we'll summarize objectives of employee compensation programs and evaluate, to some extent, evaluate pay systems and fringe benefits. All right, so let's move into Chapter 11. And human resource management is something that we need to pay attention to, and we must remember the most important thing, and that is the most important asset, the most important resource that any organization has is its employees, its humans. It's also the most expensive. So we really have to pay a lot of attention to, pardon me, to what we do with employees and to how they're managed, and to make sure that we are addressing their needs appropriately. So human resource management is a process of, first of all, determining what we need to staff the organization, and then finding those people, otherwise known as recruiting. After we've recruited, we have to select from those that we've recruited. Now, there's a weeding out process that goes through the selection, and then we need to develop and motivate them, evaluate them, and compensate them. So HR has gone well beyond the old personnel days, and we really need to pay attention to that, because we have to think about recognized employees and then keep up with the various laws that have changed that affect how we do and how we work with employees. Now, figure 11.1 shows us the legal environment. And I don't intend to go over this, but you notice that the organization goals are in the center here, and then all the things that impact on them: valuation, selection, recruitment, what we talked about, motivation in Chapter 10, employees and management issues, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. I'm not going to go over this slide a whole lot, but we do need to talk about a couple of these things and what happens here. But one of the things that I want you to pay attention to, and we don't discuss this in this course. I did another course I taught, and that is what you post on Facebook can get you in trouble. So most all companies have a social media policy, and my advice to you is find out what it is and don't violate it. Someone will say to me, and maybe to you, hey, listen, what I do off the company clock is my business, not theirs. And I would certainly agree with that. The unfortunate fact is that when you do something that's negative, someone will say, Johnny Jones, employed by XYZ Corporation, was caught selling drugs. I'm only using a thing here that we know happens quite frequently. And that brings bad reputation to the company, even though Johnny Jones selling those drugs had nothing to do with what he was doing at work. Maybe. Well, let's say it didn't. But the company's been dragged into this, and now it has this reputation to defend. And so whatever the policies are, know about them and do your best to adhere to them. The text says it differently on this slide than I do. I said most important resource. They say humans, employees are the ultimate resource. And we have to understand that as our employment has improved since we went through this disaster that started in late 2007, really mushroomed in 2008. Companies are scrambling to find the best of the best. And so recruitment is a lot different. And companies are going to work very hard to retain people because it's expensive to replace them. So yeah, we're going now from a buyer's market to a seller's market, a seller being the person who's being recruited. I'm selling my talents, my attributes, my characteristics, my abilities to you, and I'm going to sell them to the highest bidder, or I'm going to sell them to the place I want to work best, that offers me the best opportunities for advancement, etc., or maybe the best benefits. So we have to think about it. I'll give you an idea about benefits. You don't think benefits don't mean things to people. Some years ago, I had a friend that was an accountant, and he had 2 job offers. And one job offer was in downtown Cincinnati with a well-known firm. The other job offer was from another well-known firm, which was on the outskirts of downtown. It wasn't out in the suburbs, but it was on the outskirts, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 blocks from downtown. And he took the job with the company that was on the outskirts of downtown. And I said, Roger, why did you do that? And yeah, be downtown, always great places to eat and everything else. He said, XYZ company had free off-street parking. And that was a benefit to him. If he worked downtown, he was going to have to pay for parking. I don't think the salaries were any different, but it was a benefit. And that was a benefit that he needed or felt that he needed. So that's what we're talking about. Now notice here, these are challenges of finding high-level workers. We can, in some cases, as happened too often, why do I need a higher education? Well, one of the reasons you need a higher education is because many things have changed in the workplace. If you're not computer literate, you can't write well, you can't express yourself well, you may not get a job. You can't think critically, etc. So that's why we have people going through institutions of higher learning. Now, there's one thing here that is on this slide that I do not want you to pay attention to, and that says a declining economy with fewer full-time jobs. We don't have a declining economy today. We have an economy that's building. Now, yes, that may change. We have a new administration. We have a Federal Reserve that is programmed to probably raise interest rates several times this year. That may impact employment. We don't know those things. But at the present moment, the economy is moving along, probably not as fast as we would like to us, and probably not on the trajectory that we would like for it to. But it's better than what it was. We are adding more people to the workforce. And by the way, if I just want to pass something on to you, I'll give you an idea of that, and that is talking about that we have just completed 74 consecutive months of positive job creation in the United States. That's 6+ years. And maybe it's 75 now. I don't know what December is going to bring. I don't think December's come out yet. But that's certainly better than what we, maybe not as good as back in the heydays when Bill Clinton was president, or maybe even when Ronald Reagan was president, but certainly much better than what it has been. What impacts HR today? This particular slide here impacts HR today because we didn't have laws that actually, well, we might have had in some parts of the country, but we didn't have federal laws that actually discriminated against people. At least I don't think they did. And I may be off base here. But we had a prevailing thought process that did discriminate. And we discriminated against people of color and against women in the workplace. And fathers did that as well, and mothers did that as well. I was in postgraduate school with a woman who was a school teacher, and I don't remember what she was going to what she was going on to complete her postgraduate work on, but she told me when her father was a physician, she told her dad that that's what she wanted to do when she grew up. She wanted to be a physician. He said, "You have three choices. You can be a nurse, you can be a secretary. I forgot what a teacher. You can be a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary. Those are your choices." So we did that, and now we have laws on the books that say, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't do it based upon color or race or creed or national origin or religion. All that or age, all that stuff's out. You hire and you fire based upon qualifications, nothing else. And we have equal employment law. We have Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces the law. And the EEOC can go in and place sanctions against employers and require, as it says here, them to keep records of things that they've done. We also have affirmative action, which, by the way, is not law of the land. Affirmative action, in other words, it's not been enacted into law and signed by Congress and signed by the president. Affirmative action was set up by President Lyndon Johnson and by executive order in 1965 to right the wrongs and to open the playing field. And President Johnson did that because he had remembered seeing Hispanic people in the area in which he lived that had no opportunity for employment. So we have it. There's a lot of contention about affirmative action. I happen to be in favor of it, not because it's up here, but I've had the opportunity to write a couple papers about affirmative action when I was in graduate school, and I firmly believe it. Affirmative action doesn't say you have to hire somebody because of his or her skin color or because the person's a woman. What it says is we want to give everybody an equal opportunity. And if you do that, you're going to hire the best and the brightest. And by casting the net wide enough, you're going to get those people who have been historically disadvantaged. Well, a lot of people don't believe that. A lot of people don't like it. And we've had lawsuits over it. And I really think affirmative action is under great pressure. And the Supreme Court has not taken an affirmative action case for this year, but I suspect that we'll see them come up again. Reverse discrimination, we hear a lot about that. We hear a lot about it, but there really isn't that much of it. That's saying we're giving jobs to people based upon their color, etc., and we're negating white males. And I just don't think that's true. But it's there, and down at the bottom, we've had a lot of contention about it, and there have been lawsuits about it. I don't think it's true. That's my opinion, by the way, and you can say that that's what I said. That's my belief. Age discrimination is just protecting people over age 40 from indiscriminate firing. We know that happens. I give you an old statement that people say, well, they had a salesman and he was in his 50s and they could fire. And I use salesman. I didn't use saleswoman because the story was given to me by that way. And we can let that person go and hire two people that are 25 to be salespeople, and we'll generate more business and pay less money. How true that was, I don't know, but a lot of people felt that was the case. Fact of the matter is that employers have to know HR law, or the law that impacts human resource management. Ignorance of the law is not a defense. So if you have a small company and you have X number of employees, find out where you fall in a category. Some laws apply to you because of the number of employees that you have, and some will not. But you need to find out where you are, because you don't need to get yourself into a lawsuit. So find that out, get a little legal advice, et cetera, et cetera. And as the last thing says on the slide, The law changes frequently. So find out what the story is. Human resource planning is something that human resource managers have to go through. And there's a process here that we talk about. And so you need to know that. So you need to know how many employees you have currently, what their job skills are, what the education goes with that, experience, etc., and what you expect is going to happen in the future. And you're going to get this, but HR people used to just keep the personnel records, and that's all they did. In the big companies, they sit at the corporate table today. So they know what's going on because it had to be part of that strategic planning process. So you inventory what you have now, a projected inventory of what you're going to need. Then you have to prepare what's known as a job analysis. Now, I go back and forth with one of you today in the forum posting. Very critical. This tells us about the job and what the jobs are. And you need to have that because from the job analysis, you write two other very important documents. Job description says what the person is going to do, and the job specifications. That talks about experience and education and a few other type things. One of the complaints is that they change a lot. Yeah, but they shouldn't. You should do a job analysis, and they're going to be static for a couple of years, and then go back and review them. You don't change things just because. Now, sometimes they need to be changed. And there are ways to do that, which we're not going to dwell on here. But you should have them because you need to have them, especially when you get to performance appraisal. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I incorporated number 3 and number 1 because I believe you do that at the same time, or you should. You should be thinking about that. Find out where you are in the labor market. What that means is I need X employees down the road. Is the area in which we operate, does that area have people with those skills? If not, I'm going to have to expand where I look. 50 miles, 100 miles, I don't know. Where is it I need to look? And then you have to, in concert with the CEO, et cetera, you do the strategic plan. Okay, we talked a little bit about recruiting, and that's everything that we need to do to find the right number of qualified people to apply when we need them to apply. Now, I'm talking about application. I'm not talking about candidates yet. Application. So we do whatever we want to do. You know, we go through Career Builder or Monster.com or internal advertising and maybe newspapers, et cetera, trade magazines, whatever it is, to try to find the people with the requisite skills that we need. And we write an advertisement that's specific and say we need 10 people. Well, the old rule of thumb was you need six applicants to fill to fill one position, so you need at least 60 applicants for 10 vacancies, and that may be a little bit higher today. So once you've gotten this pool of people who are applicants, well, I'm not going to talk about that. We'll skip that because I don't think we really need to discuss that too much. So this just talks about employee sources, where you're going to find them, et cetera. And you can see this on your figure 11.4, excuse me, at the bottom of page 308. I'm not going to go through this because you can think about this. It doesn't take a lot of rocket science to where you're going to find employees, what the pool is. So anyway, we found these people. These are people that we call applicants, and they have submitted a resume or a application or both, and we have weeded out the people who do not meet the minimum qualifications. Notice I stressed the word minimum. And then from that, we're going to select a pool of people who hold the minimum qualifications. And that's initial. We've done initial screening. This is known as, to me, a secondary screening. And it will take those people and we'll move them all over to testing if that needs to be done, or to the hiring manager, or both. And what we're doing here is we're selecting the best out of those people who meet the minimum qualifications. Obviously, if we've done a good job, we're going to have some people who exceed the minimum qualifications. And here's the selection process. We've already talked about it. We've got the applications, and we've done the interviews and follow-up interviews, tests that I've talked about. After we've completed those and we've put people through background checks, we may or may not, although most people do today, physical examinations, because there's a real concern about people who have drug problems or alcohol problems, and then establishing some type of trial period. You need to stay away from probation because that conjures up all sorts of things. What that says is that after 90 days, well, I'm going to use that as arbitrary. Somebody says you're going to keep the person. That may not be the case. And many states are at will. You need to find out if your state has at will employment. A lot of courts are taking dim views on at will. That's an old English law that we've adopted in the United States. So you need to make sure you need to set up parameters. And determine whether or not the person is going to be worthwhile. You could have a trial period, but that should be in a contract that's signed. So everybody knows. This is a gee whiz slide. Just says mistakes that people have made on their applications and resumes, cover letters, etc. They didn't check their references, whatever that happens to be. We talked about Facebook. Just find out about it and act accordingly. Companies can hire contingent workers, and of course that keeps their costs down because you're not paying full freight for the most part. You may not have to pay workers' compensation and some of those other type things for contingent workers. You need to know what the law is, because you cannot treat a contingent worker as a full-time employee or as a regular employee, full-time, part-time. They are treated differently. And Microsoft got a lot of problems with this because Microsoft had a thing called brown bag lunches. And they brought people in, other employees, in a brown bag. Either they brought their brown bag or they gave them brown bag lunches. And they sat and talked about different things going on in the company. They were requiring contingency workers to do that. Once they took that step, they made them an employee, not a contingency worker. And they had to stop doing that. So find out what the deal is. Here's why you hire contingency workers and save on employee benefits, etc. And of course, you may have increased peak and work and things of that nature. So that's always needed. If you are in employment with someone who is an intern, please make sure that interns are being treated as interns. They are very often entry-level positions. They're unpaid. You need to be careful about what you allow them to do. We need to both train and develop employees. Now, there's a difference between the two, but we tend to mix and match. Training is teaching an employee to do a specific task. Developing an employee, on the other hand, is for the long term. We tend to develop people mostly based upon where they are in the company. And usually we think about developing managers, but we train rank and file people and supervisors. So if we're going to train or develop anybody, we have to assess the needs of the organization plus the needs of the individual. And then we want, that's known as a needs assessment. Then we design a training to meet those needs. And then we need to go back and evaluate and find out whether the training was effective. Too often we don't do the last. and we tend to reinvent the wheel when we didn't need to at all. These are the most commonly used training and development programs. I'm not going to go through this to you. On-the-job training is certainly one of the most important, but orientation is something we do all the time. And we have to think about orientation in this manner. We have to orientate the person to the organization, and then we have to orientate the person to his specific job and the department in which he or she works. We fail to do either one of those, we're going to have an employee walking out the door. And this just talks about the development part. We do things like on-the-job coaching. It's a little bit different than on-the-job training. Put them in understudy positions, use job rotation we talked about in chapter 10, and then other types as well. Why do people quit? Biggest total unhappy with management. The next one is limited advancement. 68%, over 2/3 of the reasons that people leave a position, an organization, fall into those two categories. Use networks and mentoring. Mentoring is a little different than coaching. This is where you give a person somebody who's been around for a while, and that person shows them the ropes, et cetera, et cetera. And remember that this networking extends outside the workplace. It's more than just, hey, here you are, and on the job, and then when the whistle blows, we're not going to pay any more attention to you. We have to, for the most part, although there are some people that don't like it, and there's some initiative to get away from it, it's still around today, and that's performance appraisal. Many different ways to do performance appraisals, and I'm not going to talk about the types of tools that are used to do performance appraisals as much as I'm going to talk about doing them and what you have to do and how they have to go. We can use things like 360 reviews, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. It doesn't make any difference as long as they're done. And they're done in this way. You are evaluating a person or appraising a person, an employee, based upon performance standards that are normally outlined in a job description, and they're measurable. The employee knows what the standards are because he or she has a copy of the job description. We evaluate performance against standard. Notice what I'm saying here. Evaluate performance, not the person, performance. And we have a feedback session where we discuss the results with the employee, stressing the positive first and then talking about what needs to be improved. That's step 5. And then using what has come up with to make various decisions for training, for development, for promotion, maybe for pay raises, etc. This next slide, figure 11.5 in your text, in the middle of page 317, gives us things to do and don't for performance appraisals. Let's not talk so much about the do's, but the don'ts. Don't attack the person. Never do that. You're evaluating work. You're evaluating standard. Now, if there's something in your performance appraisal that talks about being a good corporate employee, that they adhere to values and norms and things of that nature, yeah, you can do that, but you have to be careful again that you're talking about where the line has been crossed or not been adhered to. Don't attack the person. That destroys everything you're trying to do. Make sure you have sufficient time to do them. Make sure that you're conducting the feedback session in private, and by all means, end everything on a positive note. These are the reasons we use performance appraisal. We talked about some of them before. I'm not going to go over them again. You can see them, and it's important to do that. Here are some errors that are made. A contrast that compares one employee to another. Don't do that. You're comparing You don't go now. There are things known as forced comparison. That's a different issue. If you're going to use that type of form, that type of rating system, understand what the parameters are. But this is a mistake unless you're into that. Halo or hard effect performance. The most recent performance, plus or minus, adversely or positively affects the overall rating. And then similar to me, the more he is or the more she is like me, the better the rating's going to be. Have to watch out for that. Compensation programs. Compensation programs are set up to attract the type of employees you want and to retain the employees that you need. You want them to be there to be an incentive for them to work better, be more efficient, be more effective, more productive. And notice here, you want them to help you be competitive in the marketplace. Now, your pay can be one of three things. You can lag the market, which is exactly what it says. You can meet the market, or you can exceed the market. And you have to understand what are the three you choose and why. And if you want employees to stay, look at the last bullet. You have to provide them some type of financial security. Otherwise, they're going someplace else. It's as simple as that. Now, you can have different types of pay systems. A salary, it's not normally a fixed compensation. I'm salaried. I am paid the same amount of money no matter the number of hours I work. Other people are hourly. They're paid for the number of hours they work. By the way, it doesn't mean to say that if I'm paid for X number of hours, I'm going to work half of that. That doesn't mean to say that. If I continued to do that, I would be asked to vacate the premises. And then you have a piece rate system where you're paid based upon the number of pieces that you did. Other types are commission, where you are being paid on a percentage of, by the way, this can be seen on page 319, figure 11.6. You're paying on the number of sales that you've had. Bonus plans, exactly what it says. You go over mission, you get extra money, and then profit sharing. Pardon me, companies made profit, you're going to share in that profit. And then you have gain sharing plans, and then you have stock options. You can also compensate teams. Now, one of the problems with compensating teams is, and by the way, a lot of teams do this, they're based on skill-based pay and then gain sharing. Gain sharing is if performance is increased, you're going to pay more. Skill is when skills increase, you're going to pay more. One of the things you have to be careful about in teams is that sometimes the weakest link in the team gets the same amount of pay. A lot of angst about that, a lot of complaint about that. Just need to make sure that you're doing what it is that you want to do and it's doing. Well, I'm not going to talk too much about this because this is a big contention. As you know, we have a new administration. The administration doesn't like the Affordable Care Act. Neither do the Republicans who control Congress. So we're going to find something different here. Well, one of the things I can say to you is it's very important. And the other thing I can say to you is the United States, as a country, pays more for its health care than many other countries do, and we don't get near the benefit. So it isn't just offering people a benefit of health care. It is making sure that the healthcare system itself does what it's supposed to do. That's kind of outside our bailiwick. But if we don't raise our collective voices, and I'm not talking about changing the healthcare law, I can't, that's not going to be able to do. If we don't continue to raise our voices by saying, look, we need this kind of medical care for what we're paying. We need to know which hospitals are better, which doctors are better, et cetera. I mean, we do this in business. Why not do it with medical care? And I can tell you, if the bar is raised, the standard of performance will be raised as well. These are employee benefits and who pays for them. Not something we want to talk about. Other fringe benefits, again, we're not going to talk a lot about that. Cafeteria style is good because this allows you to choose benefits up to a certain dollar amount, and in some cases, if it's done right, you can take that off your tax. Now, what I mean by that is, if you pay into this cafeteria style, you choose what you want, you're paying, that comes off of pre-tax dollars. So if you're paying $100 and it's an approved cafeteria thing, then you're paying tax on $900. There are cultural challenges, and we have to understand it. We talked a little bit about that before, and we need to understand that, what the difference in culture is, and we need to pay attention to that, because many of us, whether we know it or not, are going to be working with in a global system. Flex time is exactly what it says. Employees some freedom to choose the hours they want to work. There are core hours. We're going to get to a slide here in a second. Compressed work week is where people work 3 or 4 10-hour days, and then maybe 3 12-hour days and 4 10-hour days, and then have the rest of the week off. Job sharing, 2 people sharing a full-time job. This is a flex time chart. You'll notice here that somebody can start at 6:30 and leave at 3:30, but he or she has to be at work during the core time at his or her workstation. Core time is considered 9:30 to 11, and then again from 2 to 3. Those are core work hours. And these are compressed work weeks. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. We've discussed that enough. And the home-based pay work, again, you have to be careful about it. We've talked about home-based work before, and I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Other than to understand the person who does this has to know what he or she is doing. They have to be ready to do it, and otherwise it's going to be not beneficial. We need to take a break. It's 5:37. We'll come back at 5:39 and talk about Chapter 12. Thank you. Please come back 5:39. All right, 5:39. We're back, and we're going to now discuss dealing with union and employee management issues. Let's look at our learning objectives. We're going to trace the history of organized labor in the United States, discuss the major legislation affecting labor unions, outline the objectives of labor unions, describe the tactics used by labor and management during conflicts, and look at the role of unions in the future. And then we're going to look at some of today's controversial issues like executive compensation, pay equity, child care, elder care, etc. So let's move into Chapter 12. Unions. Unions were formed to help in labor management issues, labor management negotiations. Look at what labor unions are responsible for. All of these things that we see here, job safety rules, OSHA, minimum wage, workers' compensation, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these things we take for granted today, but we wouldn't have without unions. Another is things like vacation and some fringe benefits and things of that nature. Some of those came about during World War II when the labor unions went to management and maybe even to the federal government and say, look, we know we're not going to get pay raises, but how about giving us some time off and some fringe benefits? Many states have complained about public sector unions. Wisconsin has passed some very onerous laws about restricting them and what they can do. And as we go through this talking about labor unions, the only thing I ask is that you keep an open mind about labor unions. Maybe in some cases labor unions have outlived their usefulness, but we have to be careful because a lot of the benefits that we workers, unionized or not, by the way, I'm not a unionized worker, take for granted we get because of the labor unions, just like we mentioned here. Here's what labor union is after. To work with, notice what that says, fair and competent management. The second one is to be treated as a human being, not as a peon or somebody there's a slave and a taskmaster here. And then to receive reasonable compensation for the work that they've done. In other words, let's share the wealth equitably. Organized labor in the United States started as early as 1792. You can see a little story about the cordwainers here in 1792. These are actually shoemakers. We don't usually use that term, cordwainers. But look at their work week, 60 hours a week, twice, a third as long as what most of us work. Most of us, if we do work 40 hours a week. Low wages, and of course, child labor, every place you could find it. Because why? The child labor was less expensive. And we still have child labor in many countries because it's ingrained in our culture. This helped promote unions in the United States. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, 146 women were killed. Organized labor, actually the first labor organization that we know in the United States as an organization similar to AFL-CIO was the Knights of Labor. First union formed in 1869, up almost 750,000 members, but there was a riot in Chicago. There was a strike in Chicago. And from the strike, a riot broke out and police were brought in to quell the riot. Someone threw a Molotov cocktail, or someones threw Molotov cocktails. 8 police officers killed. I'm not sure 8 police officers were killed. A number of police officers were killed, and 8 union leaders were held responsible, even though it was never proved that any union leader or any union member was responsible for throwing the Molotov cocktails. That was the death knell for the Knights of Labor. That was succeeded by the AFL-CIO, the AFL, which was a trade craft union, and it was formed in 1886. And the leader for many years was a gentleman by the name of Samuel Gompers. Then we had a thing known as the industrial unions. These were people from that were semi-skilled or no-skilled labor unions, and we can think of people like coal miners and the Teamsters, also people, the United Auto Workers, etc. Now, when I say unskilled, it means they weren't a craft person. They weren't artisans in a way. It isn't meant to demean what they did. It just means they weren't skilled. And so in 1935, as the slide says, these group of unions, not trade unions, of unions of industrialized workers, formed their own separate union, national union called the Congress of Industrial Workers, known as the CIO, and they broke away from the AFL in 1935. And then they rejoined in 1955. The leader of the CIO for many years was a man who, if you remember ever seeing his picture, had very bushy eyebrows, John Lewis. So we have about 12 and a half members, and then there are public unions in the United States, which we know now federal unions and state unions, etc. We pay for those people because we pay their wages. Now we have to stop and think and say, now wait a minute, should we stop paying their wages? Well, you can think that if you want, but then a lot of places you wouldn't have any fire protection or police protection or something else. One of the things we need to remember is that we would not have unions if management treated workers fairly. The fact of the matter is they didn't. And in some cases, that's still true today. And so that's why we have unions where we have them. Many people don't think we need them as much. Maybe not. But I think that you will see that that whole field is changing. Unions grew because, from other things, laws changed, and we as a society realized we needed to do something. And the Supreme Court outlawed it for a long time, forbade strikes, and everything was on management's side. And then we finally came along with the Norris-LaGuardia Act that prohibited the use of yellow dog contracts. Now, what did a yellow dog contract mean? It means if you went to work for a company, you had to sign on your contract, I won't join a union. And you know that's really not a contingency of employment, although they made it a contingency of employment. And it was upheld by the Supreme Court. Well, we finally got some laws like that. Then we got the National Labor Relations Act and a few other things that changed that. Unions are into collective bargaining, and that is a huge issue. This, of course, I must have gone back on a slide there. I didn't mean to do that. Okay. That's collective bargaining in the public sector. All right, yeah, and that's still a contentious issue. I didn't go back, but I didn't need to be there either. You have to pay attention to that. Now, here's what happens if you want to form a union. You have to have a union drive, if you will, and you have to have a certain percentage of people sign a card, say, yes, I want to join a union. And then after that percentage is those petitions, if you will, pardon me, are sent to the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board. They will come and hold an election. And it has to have 50% plus one to certify a union as the bargaining agent. If the decertification, go back through the same process, getting people at work to say, hey, no, I don't want the union to be bargaining agent for me. And then when you reach a certain threshold, the National Labor Relations Board again will come in and hold an election. Again, 50% plus one, say no union, then the union is decertified. Here's why people join a union. Of course, pro-union attitude, where that certainly means something to anything. But normally what happens is you have poor management, or management are treating people unfairly, or at least they're perceived to be being treated unfairly. And so they need something else. A negative organizational climate, could be poor working conditions, could be any number of things. Union has a good reputation. It does promote job security, and in most cases, it does talk about increase in salary. Union negotiated labor management agreement. This is the terms of the contract. Most labor union contracts last about 3 years. Some will last a little bit longer, but normally 3 years it seems to be the minimum. And the union security clause stipulates that workers who benefit from the union being the bargaining agent either have to join the union or pay dues to the union. I think we're going to see that under fire, and we're going to see it lessened. There was a suit that went before the Supreme Court last year, and the Supreme Court deadlocked because it only had 8 people, and it returned it to the lower court, which was the appeals court for the Ninth Circuit, I think, out in California, or out west anyway. And they had held for the union. There was a teacher who said, "Hey, I don't want to pay any union dues," and he challenged that. I expect to see that case come back, and I expect to see that rolled back because the new administration will most likely appoint a judge who is unsympathetic to unions. I hate to say that, but that's kind of the way the Supreme Court works. People are appointed to the Supreme Court based upon their ideological philosophy, not necessarily their grounding in the law. Doesn't mean to say they're bad lawyers. It's just the way it is. Closed shop agreement means you have to be in a union before you can work. Union shop agreement says you don't have to be a member of the union to be hired, but you have to agree to join the union after hire. And then an agency shop agreement allows employers to hire non-union workers who don't have to join but do have to pay dues. And that, I think, is what we'll see eliminated. Now, here's the closed shop agreement that was outlawed by the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Interesting to note that President Truman vetoed that act, but his veto was overridden. Union shop, we talked about that. This is where in the here, employer can hire anyone, but they have to join a union afterwards. Agency shop, as we talked about, and open shop, which we've also talked about. Now, we have a number of states that have right to work laws, and that simply says you don't have to join a union or be a member of a union if you want to work. You can see the number of right to work states in figure 12.5 at the bottom of page 341. Now, here's how we resolve grievances, and there's a figure in your text on page 342, 12.6. And it starts out with a grievance, and an employee or employee say, "Hey, management's being unfair, and they're not holding to the negotiated agreement, and we need redress." And this will be taken to the shop steward, who is a union official who works at the organization, and he represents the employees on a daily basis. And then you can see what happens there. It goes to shop steward, it goes to local union, then it goes to union grievance committee, etc., and where management goes on the other side. This is what we use in the mediation and arbitration for salaries. The bargaining zone, that's the range of options. Starts initial offer, final offer, and that's the bargaining zone. You don't expect it to be at this limit or that limit. You expect it to be somewhere in the middle. 2 ways to settle, and I'm going to say strike a dispute. One is by mediation and the other is by arbitration. A mediator is a third party. He or she is not aligned with either the union or management. And what their purpose is to keep the sides talking. They'll settle from one side to the other and bring back, they said this and they said that. Would you consider this? Would you consider that? It's kind of a facilitating job, if you will. An arbitrator is exactly the reverse. The arbitrator has the authority to set a binding agreement. And we find that in the sports, particularly in baseball, where the player and management goes to arbitration. And what the arbitrator decides is final. Both have decided what the arbitrator says is going to be final. And so everybody knows that. The problem with arbitration is you always have a winner and a loser. Yeah, we've done that. We need to pass that. Sorry, I skipped here. Here's what unions will do. They'll strike. They'll boycott. They'll have a work slowdown. That's often known as working to the rule. They won't work any overtime. And then they'll picket. And that means they'll have people walking outside management saying, outside the place of employment, usually with signs that say, management's unfair because of such and such. Strikes says nobody's going to go to work. Primary boycott is where the union has its members and others to boycott the organization they work for. Secondary boycott tries to get others to stop doing business with the organization. That's what management does, locks out. Okay, you guys talk about going on strike, we'll just lock the doors. You won't come to work. And we lock the doors, we don't have to pay you. They'll go to court to seek an injunction to have the workers come back to work. That doesn't happen as often as it used to. And then they'll hire strike breakers. We're going to skip that one because that's in your text that you can work or not work. These are challenges for unions. The number of people in unions is falling. Many workers have given back primarily to keep their jobs. We're liable to see unions more in things like teachers' assistants in colleges and universities, and perhaps residents and interns in hospitals. We just talk about union membership by state. We don't need to discuss that. This is a contentious issue. How much should CEOs be compensated? That's something that we can really settle here. But one of the things is that is coming to fore, although I'm not seeing enough of it, is that CEOs should be compensated based on performance of the organization. This is another issue. Should college athletes be allowed to join unions? Somebody said yes, that's gone to labor relations. It said no, but it's something we're going to see come back again and again. Compensating pay equity. This is something we have to pay attention to. Women make approximately 77% of what men earn. I think the figure is actually a little higher. It's a little closer to 80%, but it's still not what it ought to be. A person doing the same job as a man, a woman doing the same job as a man should be paid the same amount of money. Now, if seniority comes into it, that's different. But everything being equal, same pay. It should not be any argument about that whatsoever. Here's what we're talking about. Sexual harassment, big issue. It needs to be reported when it's seen, and corrective action needs to be taken. Two types of sexual harassment. Quid pro quo, it means you do this and I'll give you that. Normally thought of as sexual favors. I don't like to have to say that, but that's what it is. And the other is a hostile work environment. There they are here, explained a little bit differently than what I said. And there's some other issues coming to face us. Child care issues, elder care issues. These are issues that are coming up, and companies have to face them if they intend to continue to have the type of employee they want. Yeah, I was listening. I was leaving work here last week and listening to a piece on National Public Radio about people scrambling for childcare and the cost of childcare. And good childcare has extensive waiting lists, and it's difficult for people to get their children into this type of environment so they can go to work. Unfortunately, the way things are today, many families feel like they need two incomes. But regardless, even if they don't need two incomes, women don't want to be tied down to home all the time. And so they're looking for childcare. It's very expensive. Many companies, many forward leaning companies, and by the way, if you look at the SAS video, they have on site daycare. When I was stationed in St. Louis at the Personnel Center, not too long after I left, after I was reassigned, I should say, they brought in a daycare center and opened a daycare center, and this was a big boon for people. I don't know what the charge was, et cetera, but this is something that employers might want to look at as a benefit so they can help retain people and keep them in the workforce. They need to, as I mentioned, if you have an employee who leaves for whatever reason, it's very expensive to replace that person. You have to recruit them, everything that goes into that. You have to have people that do the screening. You have to have people that do the interviewing, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all things you're taking people away, in some cases, from their primary jobs, but maybe doing the interviewing, et cetera. And so you're paying that person to do something else that he or she is not being productive at that particular moment. So this just goes back to recruiting. It goes back to lots of types of things about how do we get the best people we want. We have to offer the type of benefits that we need to make sure that we're going to be able to keep these people. First of all, attract these people, and then once we've attracted them and hired them, we're going to be able to retain them. You don't want a revolving door in the recruiting and selection process, and in the retention process. It's too costly. So that plus elder care, that's also a big issue. Was an issue to me some years ago when my mother was aging, and her health was failing. That's something that we really had to pay attention to. And notice that what this slide says: almost a third of the households are providing some care to an elderly person. And if you're doing that, you can't be working full time. So it's something that miss about 15 million days of work per year. And we have right now, we have an aging population, and that's not going to change in the near foreseeable future. So it's something we need to think about. It's also something we need to think about for the people coming into the workforce that have children that need daycare. Very, very, very important type thing, and something that we really need to stop and pay attention to. Well, that brings us to the end of chapters 10, 11, and 12. And the question that we have for today, I need to get to the right page, if you will. And I'm still not there. I should have been, but I wasn't. One of the similarities between the job motivations or job enrichment theory and Hertzberg's motivating factors. What similarities are there between the job enrichment characteristics, which you can find on page 283 in your text, and the motivating factors in Hertzberg's dual factor theory? Motivating factors can be found in figure 10.2 on in figure 10.2 on page 275. So what are the similarities between Hertzberg's motivating factors and the job enrichment core characteristics? There are similarities between them. I want you to look at those, put those in your own words, do a little critical thinking, and see how they match up one to the other. Similarities between the job enrichment characteristics found on page 283 and the motivating factors in Hertzberg's dual factor theory found in figure 10.2 on page 275. I thank you for your attention at 6:06 this evening, and we'll be back next week to begin our chapters on marketing. Thank you and good night.